Well, months and months ago now, I heard that Abu Jalil al-Singhais had worn out the rubber tips on his crutches. Now, first of all, that's not like the biggest issue here, right? The biggest issue is he and the other human rights defenders shouldn't be in prison at all. But that seemed to me an issue of basic humanity, really of almost spitefulness on behalf of the authorities. Why would you not give a man who needs crutches to walk the replacement tips that he needs to keep him safe? So I'd heard from his family that when these tips were worn out, they weren't being replaced, and actually made it very dangerous for him to use the crutches because then they would slide around. So I looked up how much they cost. They cost a few pounds, so I sent him some. And then a week or so later, he was able to use rubber tips on his crutches. I mean, it was just it was such a small, petty, minor thing that it really struck me how mean it was just to prevent a man who needed crutches from being able to walk. It's something so simple and so easy to fix. I didn't buy and send those crutches to him to humiliate the Bahraini authorities. I mean, it just seemed a very practical, maybe useful thing to do if he was ever given them back. And it seemed to have worked. And I do think that there's something shameful about them not allowing him to walk properly, basically. But I didn't do that to score points or to make the authorities feel bad. I mean, the point is that he should be allowed to walk, and they should feel ashamed that they're not letting him walk properly. Recently too, I wrote a letter to the Bahraini ambassador to Britain saying that I had been working on issues around Bahrain on and off for 30 years. I realised that I started to work for Amnesty International in early 1991. And I remember back from then, one of the first issues that I spoke about in the media was Bahrain. So I went back to look at the report from 1991, and it really was a back to the future, where the issues which were raised 30 years ago were ones around torture, around unfair trials, around political prisoners. And they're still the issues that we're campaigning around today. And so it was weird to me that in those days we were using typewriters, and today, of course, we've got all now super high tech, and yet the things that we are raising, the things that we're writing about, are the same issues that we were writing about in the last century. I mean, this isn't 3 or 4 years ago, this is decades ago. And that really struck me, taking a long view of things, of how little has been achieved in terms of Bahrain improving its human rights record. The Bahraini government really hasn't progressed very much in the last 30 years in terms of human rights. It still has political dissidents in prison, human rights defenders in prison. It still suffocates, really, civil society and nearly all peaceful dissent. I mean, there has to be some progress. Bahrain talks a big game about being modern. I see that there's a new economic plan for this century, but it's stuck back in the 20th century on its human rights. And I don't think that you can progress one thing without progressing them all, really. And so it just needs to modernise. It needs to modernise its human rights. It needs to stop torturing people. It needs to stop putting people in prison for peacefully dissenting. It needs to encourage civil society. It needs to have an inclusive politics, because otherwise it just looks like it's never going to progress and never going to reform.